To give you a little background on this lecture, which is about education, some reform movements, and the way people entertain themselves in the Gilded era, it's important to know that in 1870, the beginning of this era, late 1800s, about 2% of all 17-year-olds graduated from high school. Public schools started during this era, and by 1900, in the early 1900s, 31 states would have laws that required students to go to school between the ages of 8 and 14. It's also important to know that poverty was still a problem, even though a middle-class family could survive on $1,000 a year back then. So let's start with reforming society. Because poverty was such a huge problem, the wealth in America kind of came up with the idea that we need to reform society. This was not done by the government. This was done by private charities. And the mission is to help the needy. Charity organizations began to form themselves in cities and in the countryside. And really, the goals of the charity organizations were to help people raise their kids, to show parents who didn't know how because they grew up in poverty, how to cook for their children healthy meals so they'd be healthy, how to clean and keep the house clean so there'd be less chance of diseases. One other thing they would do was charity organizations would provide sometimes clothing, housing for sure, jobs and job training programs, and sometimes health care, especially dental care. This is actually a charity dentist office during this era. In return for you coming to the charities, they're usually religious, they were able to preach to you, to send their religious message to you. They had a captive audience when you were there for charity reasons. This led to sociology, which is a brand new science during this era. And sociology is really the study of how people interact with one another in society. There are several scientists who would later be called sociologists during this era who are really trying to figure out how relationships work, especially between the workers and their owners, between the rich and the poor, how the poor interacted with each other, and how that behavior could be modified. One of the modifications on behavior was the large amount of immigration that was going on during this time. And one of the prevalent thoughts of this era, especially amongst white Americans, was an idea which I think is still around. It becomes abundantly clear during election time, which is nativism. And nativism is when you favor native-born Americans, not Native Americans, but native-born Americans over their immigrant partners. So the immigrants would come over. They couldn't get jobs because people who owned the companies were hiring native-born Americans. It's really a form of discrimination. And that discrimination was so prevalent that politicians were creating laws that would restrict immigration and the ability for immigrants to own property in a lot of places. Another behavior modification during this era was the idea of prohibition. A lot of states began to adopt this. This is the ban on the manufacture and the sale of alcoholic beverages. And some states, like North Carolina and Kentucky, still have counties that still do not allow the sale or production of alcohol. This poster I like because it says, if you drink, the money you're spending on drinks is stealing the food from your table. Some states became dry. Purity crusaders who really wanted prohibition across the country, they were working for a nationwide prohibition campaign, which would actually happen later on. They were also working to stop immoral or corrupt behavior, and that could have been anything from prostitution, which was illegal, but nobody really did anything to stop it, to gambling, things like that. For schools, the main goal of schools was to have kids who were ages 16 to 14 do two things: to learn to read and write, literacy, and to assimilate immigrants into American society. Those were the two main goals of schools, and of course, like these pictures show, the lower school full of whites, the upper school full of blacks. Schools across the country were still segregated, and just like the pictures show, white kids sort of had the nice facilities, and black kids had what was left over. All right, we'll finish this lecture on the next